Okay, today we're going to be learning Shekalim Daf Yudalit. Shavua Tov to everyone. Today's daf is dedicated by Yechiel Berkovitz in honor of his mother's yahrzeit and in loving memory of Sarah F. Berkovitz. Sarah was a survivor of the Holocaust and valued Jewish education. Okay, we have a really good daf today for those who are struggling a little bit with Shekalim. I know it's not the easiest Masechet, as I told you in the beginning, because it's Yerushalmi, it's not as well edited and it's kind of complicated to get through and not so simple. Plus, it's talking about issues that are hard for us to connect to our lives sometimes, some of the details of the temple. But today we're going to see a whole different perspective. Today we're going to get into the people behind the temple and family secrets and all sorts of really interesting things. And we're going to end with, we're going to start getting into how did the inner workings go? How did it work? If I wanted to go to the temple and buy something, who was selling it to me? How did it work? Tokens and things like that. Very, very interesting, relevant topics. So here goes. Starting from the very bottom of your Gimel Amabet. Nechunya Chofer Shichin, right? We already started with this yesterday's daf about the people and who was in charge of what. And let's start with Nechunya Chofer Shichin. He would dig pits in order to get water, dig wells for the people so that they'd have water in order to drink on the way to the temple. Shaya Chofer Shichin u'ma'arot, he would dig ditches and caves, where there was cold water. And well, there's different explanations here. I'll go with one right now. And where he could find hot water. Now, under what rocks would there be? He would be able to kind of lift the rock and find places for cold water, hot water, and how hot the water was. Some people say it's where there were fissures and where he could find how deep he'd have to dig in order to get, maybe it's that. So different explanations. Amar Rabbi Acha, here comes a out of the blue statement. Umeit beno b'tzama, and his son died of thirst. Here he was, the guy who made sure that everybody had water to drink, and his son ended up dying of thirst. Okay, now you could go in one direction, which is, the shoemakers, the shoemakers' children go barefoot. Here he got water for everyone and his son. He didn't take care of his son. But the Gemara is going to go off in the direction of how could that possibly be, right? Doesn't God, midah keneged midah, here he saved people through water and his son was killed by thirst. So they don't exactly address this straight on, but they're clearly getting at it by the following statements and then stories. Amar Rabbi Chanina, Manda Amar Rachmana Batran, Yitvatrun b'nei me'an. If you think that God doesn't punish you for your sins, right? This is classic. People say, oh, look, I did something wrong and I didn't get struck down by lightning. Oh, look at that, right? So that's what they're going to say. If you say, I didn't get struck down by lightning immediately, right? And you think God is going to let it go, well, your intestines are going to rebel against you, right? Which means you'll get sick. This goes back to the last thing we learned in the previous stuff about Ben Achia that was in charge of the intestines. People got these serious stomach diseases in the Mikdash. Therefore, now they explain, God, this is what we call erech hapayim. He doesn't get angry immediately. He waits. Why does he wait? Because he wants to see if you're going to repent. If you don't repent, then you'll eventually get your punishment. Gabe didei means he will demand it at some point from you. Amar Rabbi Acha, Ktiv, Usvivav nisara me'od. Okay, this pasuk is from Tehillim, and it means his in the surroundings there was like storm in a very strong manner. Nisara from the lashon of sa'ara with the samach, even though this is with the sin. What does this mean? What do we learn from here? This is very famous, that God is very careful with tzaddikim, with people that are closer to him, with a chut ha'sa'ara, by a hairline, meaning even very small things that they do, they get punished for. There's a few different, okay, there's going to be two psukim to teach this. This is one of them. Amar Rabbi Yossi, lo mitam hazeh, not from that pasuk, elamin ma dechtiv, v'nora hu al kol svivav. His fear is upon those who are the closest to him. God's fear is on the people closer to him rather than the people who are farther away from him. In other words, God is much more careful with the people closer to him. Why is this? So people give different reasons. Maybe because when someone who's close to God does something bad, it's a much bigger chilul Hashem, right? We all know, happened in the news recently, someone who was a very prominent person, it turns out was really doing awful things. And that becomes a huge chilul Hashem, right? People say, oh, look, this is what religious people do, and God, the people who do amazing things, really reflects very poorly. And it's also another reason, it's showing people, right? They're the people who people look at and people see what goes on. So if they see it happens to them, they must have done something wrong, then people will learn, oh, well, if I do something wrong, then I'll also get punished. So there's this idea of the people who are closest to God get punished the most, and that must be coming to explain. Again, doesn't say this directly, but that's why his son died of thirst. He must have done something wrong, and God was particularly punished him harshly because he was closer to God. Now we're going to hear a similar story with a bit of a different ending. Rabbi Chagai b'Shem Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman said, very similar. We have a chassid, okay, someone who's pious, who was a person who was digging pits, wells, and caves for people to drink, to find water. His daughter was passing over somewhere, like over a river, to get married. And she got swept up by the river. Everybody was going to this chassid to give him comfort. They wanted to comfort him. He wouldn't accept it from them. Okay, he just wasn't willing to accept. You can all be familiar with this kind of situation, right? Child dies, and he's just unwilling to accept. Al Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, the one with the donkey that we just saw, ligabe. Okay, so he comes now. He tries to comfort him, but he doesn't accept. Amar alone, Dain hu chasidchon. These are our chasidim who aren't willing to accept God's will and say, okay, I understand, God punished me, accept it. Amrule, right, which is a very harsh statement. Amrule, Rebbe, kach v'kach hayaseh, kach v'kach hirale. He said, the people said to him, listen, look at this guy. He spent his whole life trying to provide water for people. And here his daughter was punished through water. He can't get his head around it. It doesn't make any sense to him. Amal, efshar, shayam chabedet boro b'mayim, as he gave respect to God through water. Behuma kapcho b'mayim, and God strikes him with water. It just doesn't make any sense. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention the obvious question that rises from the previous story, which is, we know there's this concept that lo yumtu avot al banim ubanim lo yumtu al avot. People get punished for their own sins. And in this case, even if we say that God was strict with him with his sins, it's his son who dies and not himself who dies, which is another question, right? His son shouldn't die because he sinned. It's also another question that comes up. In other words, how could you be punished for your children's sins? These are all questions that come up. There's no good answers, not here and not anywhere really, right, about these stories. Anyway, what happens in this story? This story at least has a happy ending. So now they say to Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, and all of a sudden Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair understands the predicament and why this is so complicated. Biyad nafla havara ba'ir, all of a sudden there's the sound comes out, a rumor gets spread in the city, and they say, Bat bito shaloto ish. Say the daughter of this man is alive and well, and all of a sudden here she is coming into the town. Ita amre. So now what happened? So some people say, there's a very interesting ending to the story. Some people say, besuchte itaret. She was holding on to a branch the whole time. In other words, it's true she got swept away by the river, but she found something to hold on to. She held on to that, and that saved her life. And she was never really dead, and she was never supposed to die. She was immediately saved, just they didn't know about it. And this is what you call natural means, or she took things into her own hands and she saved herself. V'ita ambre, and some people say it was a miraculous nature what happened here. Malach yarad kidmut Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair v'hitzila. And this explains why she shows up only after Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair gets involved, because he somehow got involved and maybe prayed for her and enlisted God to help. God helped and brought her back to life, so to speak, right, through the hands of an angel that looked like Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, which is just another way of saying he intervened on her behalf once he understood the situation, and she was actually saved. What's the difference between this and the story of the thirst, right, where there it has a bad ending? Some people say the difference is that here they prayed, and because of the prayer, maybe that brought her back, right? But really the question is a very good question, why in one case it ended that way and in a different case it ended this way, right? Obviously, these are answers that we don't really have because we don't really, we're not, only God knows the answers to these kind of questions. But the sugya does at least address these issues of children dying for their parents' sins, of tzaddikim getting punished, right? All these kind of big, broad issues, which of course in the Gemara dealt with in, a very small kind of way, and then the Gemara moves on. Next topic, Gvini Karos. We're now getting to all the different people, right? We're still in this list of all the different people in the temple who had different jobs. His job is to announce, which we're going to see now. What does he announce? Shayam Machariz Bebeit HaMikdash. Early in the morning, he would be the one to wake everybody up. Mahaya Omer, what would he say? Imdu Kohanim Lavodah. Kohanim, get up, time to start working. Uleviim Leduchanam. Leviim, go get to your duchan. That was where the Leviim would sing from. V'Yisrael Ma'amadan. The regular people, they had messengers who would go. They were called the Ma'amadot. It was the first form of communal prayer. They would go and pray that the sacrifices would be accepted. Okay, it was a later development after the Mishmarot, Kehuna and Leviyah, which had these 24 Mishmarot. They then instituted 24 Ma'amadot also, not just of Kohanim and Levim who have actual work to do there, but also groups of Israel would come to pray that everything would get accepted. How great was Gvini Karos? He obviously had a very loud voice, right? We know, let's say, newscasters or radio broadcasters, right? People have strong voices. They're the ones picked for that job. So he had a very strong voice in the days without microphones or without anything else. Agrippas HaMelech shama kolo ad shmona parsaot v'natano matanot harbe. Agrippas HaMelech could be 8 kilometers away, and he heard him talk. 8 parsaot, which is 4.5 kilometers approximately, and he would hear him from that far away. And he gave him matanot rabot because he really respected the fact that he could get his voice heard so far, and therefore gave him many gifts. In Yoma, it says that he could be heard as far as Yericho, which is actually 10 parsaot. So some people explain, well, it's not that Agrippas could have heard him 10 parsaot. He just happened to be only 8 parsaot away. And that's why he heard him 8 parsaot and not 10, but really he could have been heard even 10 parsaot. Ben Gever on the Ni'ilat Sharim. By the way, Yom is our next Masechet. Okay, right? We have a Siyum in a week, by the way. Okay, on Sunday will be our Siyum. So believe it or not, we're nearing the end already. So what I want to point out here is that in Yoma, we're going to have a whole repeat of these people, like we saw in yesterday's stuff, that they're going to come up there and that these are mentioned L'Shevach, and that these are respected people, and then these are mentioned L'Gnai, these are not respected, and we're going to get to the ones who weren't respected and why they weren't respected. As I mentioned in yesterday's class, there's a few debates about which exactly who falls on what list, but we're going to see today more about some of the families that were potentially problematic. Ben Gever on the Ilat Sharim. So Ben Gever, he was in charge of locking the gates. Tirgem Rav Kome debate Rabbi Shila. Now we're on a total tangent here, which is, there's a Mishnah in Yoma that says, B'chol Yom Tormim et HaMizbeach B'kriyat HaGever. They would do the sweeping of the altar. They would have to sweep away the ashes from the previous day. It was the first thing they would do in the morning, very early in the morning. When would they do it? B'kriyat HaGever o samuchla, when the calling of the Gever is, or near it. Now, what's the calling of the Gever? So there's a debate. Is it when the rooster crows? Is Gever referring to a rooster? Or is Gever, the way we normally use it in Hebrew, is a person? When the person announces, right? When he calls in the morning, wake up everybody. So it's a big question, right? We say in our Brachot HaShachar every day, Asher natan l'sechvi vina lavchim ben yom uvein laila. Sechvi, they usually say is the rooster. That's a reference to this if you say it's a rooster. So according to the version of this story in Yoma, Rabbi Shila was teaching. He taught it is Tarnagol. And when Rav Tirgem, he was the Maturgaman, which was the person who basically acted as the microphone. The rabbi would speak, someone else would then say what they said to all the other people so they would hear. So Rav said, Kara Gavra, Achriz Kuroza. In other words, he said, Gavra is the karuz, the person who announces, a person, not a rooster. So Amarle, Amor Kra Tarnagola. He says, no, read it, say you should explain it as a rooster, not a person. Amarle, so Rav says to him, Vahatanina, but look at our Mishnah. It says Ben Gever. Eat lachlameimar bar tarnagola. You think Ben Gever was the son of a rooster? Here I'm going to use our Mishnah to prove that Ben Gever is a person and not a tarnagol, and therefore the word Gever, Kriyata Gever, is a rooster, is a person, not a rooster. Okay, so now what some people say that what's going on here really is there was a difference between the language in the Torah, where Gever is always a person, to the language in the time of Chachamim, where Gever could be a rooster. And what Rav is saying is, even in the time of the Chachamim, and I can prove it from this Mishnah, because there's a different dialect used, just like the Yerushalmi has a different dialect of Aramaic. There's also a different dialect of Hebrew used by the Mishnah. Certain words that appear in the Torah appear differently in the time of the Mishnah. So, but there was a debate about what the word gever means in the time of the Mishnah. And he's trying to say, I can prove for you from here, it might mean sometimes rooster, but it also means person. And that he proves from our Mishnah. So this is a totally side issue of what it means kriyat hagever, and they try to prove it from our Mishnah. Next, Ben Bavai ala Pekia. He was in charge of the wicks in the temple, which you would take from old clothing of the Kohanim Gedolim and prepare the wicks. So now again, we're going to get totally off topic into something else entirely. But let's just read. Shayam mizaveg or mizayeg ptilot. Okay, he would prepare the wicks. Rabbi Yossi a'al Kufra. So now we have a story happening later in time. Rabbi Yossi goes into the city of Kufra. He wanted to put people in charge of giving out food to the poor people and in charge of just the money of the community. Below kablu mine, nobody wanted the job, right? It's classic, right? Nobody wants to deal with this kind of thing. So he goes in and he says to everyone, listen, Ben Bavai ala Pekia. He was in charge of the wicks. Right? Which is a pretty pathetic job, right? I mean, it's not like announcing to people to wake up in the morning, which is really important, or not like being in charge of the doctor, which is, everyone always respects the doctor, or whatever it might be. But he was in charge of making these wicks from the leftover clothing. Like, that's not really the best job. And yet, and yet he was listed with the greatest people of the generation in this Mishnah right? Everyone's going to remember his name forever. And I want to give you a job where you're actually helping people to survive, to live. You're giving people sustenance, and you don't want this job. In other words, right? Take this job. This is very important. And in the end, right? How do you always get people to do things? Well, you'll get rewarded. People will respect you. All that. That's usually what gets people moving. Next job. Ben Arza alat siltzal. He's in charge of the symbol. Okay, they had symbols in the temple. We're going to see what he did with them. Kihad tanin and tamaz. It says in the Mishnah. Okay, the way it would work was the Leviim, we said, would go to their duchan. That's where they would stand and they would sing. When would they sing? Well, when they poured the wine libations. We're going to get to libations at the end of today's stuff, which is with a lot of the korbanot. There were libations that went with them, which was the mincha. They would bring a mincha offering, a meal offering. They would also bring wine libations and oil libations. So when the Kohen would pour the wine on the altar, the Leviim would sing. But how would they know what he was doing? They couldn't see what was going on the top of the altar. So, right, the altar was very high. So what would they do? The Kohen would wave this sudar, like a sheet or something. He would wave like a scarf. He would wave a scarf. He kish ben arz alat tzotzal. He would make a noise, make this big noise with the symbol. And then the Leviim would know. In other words, he would motion to him. He would motion to everybody else, and the Leviim would start to sing. So you're seeing the inner workings of how things went on in the temple, right? This is what's great about this daf, and in general, this section of Shekalim is, and many parts of Shekalim, it brings the whole, right? Even if it might be a little bit complicated for us, it brings the whole thing to life, from the fixing of the streets and the roads so that people could get there and finding water, and right, you get to see all the inner workings of the temple, not from a sense of how, the blood and all that, but all the behind the scenes actions that went on. It's very interesting. Next, Hugras ben Levi ala Shiur. He was in charge of singing. So now they say, he had a beautiful voice. Okay, he had a beautiful, beautiful voice. He would put his thumb in his mouth. Kama mine zemer. We all know people who could do this, right? They can make all these great noises with their mouths and with fingers in their mouth, and you can make it as if there's musical instruments going on. He was exceptionally good at this. And everyone, it's a little difficult how to translate this. Some people don't have the word lo there, but they would either like jump forward, like lurch toward him and like, oh my God, wow, we're going to sing along with you, or like be taken aback and say, whoa, what a voice, right? It caused a big reaction, whatever the reaction was, by all the other people, by his brothers, the Kohanim. Now we get to my favorite stories. In fact, Af Mishalahen is about this week, about keeping secrets and when it's okay to keep secrets, when we should tell people things, bordering on Lashon Hara and stuff. They get into all sorts of issues about that, even though it's not directly what they're talking about here. They get off on that, very interesting. in any case, right, they start off with the Coca-Cola secret and how Coca-Cola, okay, it'll be up later tonight. Their Daf Mishalahan goes up Sunday night, so it'll be up later. But anyway, right, how Coca-Cola, there's only a few people know how exactly Coca-Cola is made, and the whole thing with the hashgacha on Coca-Cola, and the rabbis had to know, and right, but they only let certain people know about it. It's a big, big secret. So Beit Garmu al Maaseh Lechem HaPanim. So they're in charge of the Lechem HaPanim. Okay, if you never did this, there's a great workshop in Israel by Jeff Seidel. Definite, if you're learning the daf, it's definitely recommended. Where he goes, you actually bake the breads of the temple, and the sugya makes a lot more sense once you go and see, because they would bake the lechem hapanim on these molds. Okay, they would put the bread around the molds, and then they would remove it from the molds. Now it was kind of shaped like a square, but a little bit open at the top, whatever. It went around this mold. It wasn't like a regular bread. And remember, it was more matzah, like it doesn't become chametz. And it was hard, right? And it's hard to take off the mold without breaking it. In fact, I think when we did it, it broke. He says, usually it breaks. It's very hard to get it not to break. And this was this special talent that Beit Garmu knew exactly how to do this. So Beit Garmu, right, without actually doing it, you can't really understand why it's so complicated. And now we're going to see what was so special about what they did. So Beit Garmu hayu b'ki'im b'maaseh lechem hapanim u'biridiyato. It's not just the baking; it's the removing it from the mold that they would put it on. Right? They would use this metal kind of mold to put it around, and then they would have to remove it from there. And that was the part that was complicated: how to do it without it breaking. And not only that, but you'll see how to do it without breaking, and also in a way that it will not get moldy throughout the week, because the lechem hapanim sat there for an entire week, and the kohanim only ate it a week later. Now, if you leave bread in your house for a whole week, unless it's got a lot of preservatives, it's not going to be very tasty, and it's going to be full of mold. And they were particularly, right, in those days, first of all, you obviously couldn't put preservatives in it, so right, that wasn't an option. So anyway, let's read what happens. They knew the secret. They didn't want to tell anybody the secret. So Shalchu Chachamim, the Chachamim said, fine, you don't tell us the secret, we're going to find someone else. We don't like that the secret's all with your family, right? What if something happens? What if you all get killed in a car accident? Right? Obviously no cars, but what if something, God forbid, were to happen, and we wouldn't know how to do it? So this isn't good. Let's go find other people who can do this. I'm sure you're not the only ones. So what they do, they went to Alexandria in Egypt. Heviu umanim Alexandria. They found the best bakers in Egypt. They said, okay, make the lechem hapanim for us. So they knew how to do it, but they didn't know how to take it off the molds. Beit Garmu, what was the difference between how they made it? They would light up the fire inside, right, like a pizza oven type thing. They would light it up inside. But then they would take the mold out with the bread out of the oven once it was already baked and hardened, and that would work, and it wouldn't get moldy, okay? Because they would let it harden, right? Like matzah. Matzah doesn't really get moldy because it's baked fully and it doesn't get moldy. So then they would take it off, and obviously that's what I said, where it was complicated to do that without it breaking. But Elu, the ones in Egypt, hayu mesikimi bifnim, so they started the same way, but rodimi bifnim, they would take it off before it was fully baked, because they knew once it hardens, we won't be able to get it off the mold without it breaking. So they would take it off when it was still inside, but then it would get moldy. So they took it off well, but it would get moldy and it wasn't useful. When they saw this, they said, everything that God created was for his own glory. Whatever God does is for his own sake. This either means he must have created Beit Garmu to have these special talents to do it for his kavod, so we're going to go bring them back. In other words, now we get it. Okay, they know it. They're the only ones who know how to do it. We have to go back to them. Some people say, we can't use this bread that's moldy. It's not respectful to God, and everything for God has to be respectful in the temple. So therefore, we can't use this bread. Whatever it was, they decide we're going back to Beit Garmu. So what happens now? Here you have the first business dealing. They said, oh, you want us back? Well, we're not going to come until you pass double. They said, oh, we see now that we're really needed. You kicked us out of the temple. You went to find someone else. Now they realize, well, they clearly want us, so we're going to double our salary. They used to get 12. portions. So they end up giving them double 24. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, right? There's a debate about how much they actually got paid. So 24, and now they doubled it to 48. So now the rabbis say to them, fine, you're working back in the temple. Now we want to understand. Why don't you want to teach us the secrets? We have good reason not to do this because we have a tradition that, and it's been passed down to our fathers, that we know in the future there's going to be a destruction of this temple. And what's going to happen if there's a destruction? If we teach people how to do this, what's going to happen? We're worried that once there's no temple, people are going to worship idols, and then they'll make this bread for their idols, and we don't want that to happen. So therefore, we have to keep it a secret so that nobody uses it for the wrong purpose. Now, what's interesting about this, right, and this is why Shiur and Chavatal get off into what's a good secret and what's not a good secret. Is this okay, what they did, or is it not okay? And that was this debate that I mentioned yesterday in Yoma. Are they in the list of the bad or not, right? It seems like they're mentioned negatively. Even though they had good reason to keep this secret, it was still looked at upon the rabbis as not a good thing. However, they end with the following interesting line, which goes back to, remember the person who goes into the temple to get the money, to be torem lishka, and he has to make sure that he doesn't do anything that will arouse suspicion of him stealing. So here also they're going to say, but there is one thing that people said they were very praiseworthy, the Beit Garmu family. They would never eat bread made with very fine flour, because the very fine flour is what was used to make the lechem apanim and the breads in the temple. And they didn't want anyone to think that they stole this very fine flour. In fact, when I went to the workshop, he said that in order to find the flour that's the closest to there, he had to get some special flour from Italy. They just don't make it so fine the way they had it in the temple. They use a very, very fine flour. They wouldn't ever make it in their house so the people wouldn't suspect them of taking from the temple. Okay, this is that pasuk we saw by Yitim Nikiim Hashem Israel, right? That you have to make sure you're above any suspicion. Okay, next story, which is almost exactly parallel, about Beit Avtinas that are responsible for the Maseh Ktoret. They made the Ktoret, the incense concoction. Okay, this is, we say every day in Tefillah or on Shabbat, depending on what nusach you daven, but we say Pitum Ktoret for sure on Shabbat, right? And at the end of the service. And there it goes through all the things in the Ktoret. And if you notice, and you'll notice this next time you say it, it says Ma'ale Ashan Koshu. They would put a little bit of Ma'ale Ashan. Ma'ale Ashan means it makes the smoke rise, but it was a type of plant that grew. Okay, there's a debate about what exactly it is, but there was a type of plant that grew that was called the Ma'ale Ashan that would make the smoke of it would cause the smoke of the incense to first rise up and then dissipate only once it rose up first. Whereas all the other smoke would usually go, the smoke would dissipate. But with this type of plant, it would make it grow, make the flame go up and then dissipate after. And that's the effect that they wanted with the Ktoret. That was the way it was supposed to be. So they're the only ones who knew about this Ma'ale Ashan. So let's read the story. So when I wanted to read that because Ma'ale Ashan sounds like, and the way the smoke grows, but it's specifically a type of plant called the Ma'ale Ashan. They didn't want to teach anybody this, what it was, the identification of what exactly this plant was. So again, they went to Mitzrayim. This is where the best of the best were. People knew how to make incense, but they didn't know how to do this. Because as I explained before, it would basically, the smoke would rise like a stick, like a rod, and then posav yored, and then it would dissipate, go to the sides. Vishal elu, but the ones in Alexandria, posamiyad, it would just immediately dissipate. So again, they realized that we need the Beit Avtinas family back. And here, according to this nusach, they quote a different verse, but if you see in parentheses, they quote the other verse that we had before. Anyone who's called in my name, I created him for my own sake, or kol pa'al Hashem lema'ano, right, as we saw before. Same thing, they said we want double wages. Maybe they heard the previous story, maybe not, right? Same story. Or Rabbi Yehuda says it's from either they went doubled from 12 to 24, they doubled from 24 to 48. Either which way, they got double salary. And again, אמרו להם, מפני מאין אתם רוצים ללמד? אמרו להם, מסורת היא בידינו מאבותינו שהבית הזה עתיד להיחרב, שלא ילמדו אחרים, ועושים כן לפני עבודה זרה שלהם. So again, they said, why don't you want to tell anyone? They said, because we know the Beit HaMikdash is going to be destroyed, and we don't want anyone to use this for idol worship. בדברים הללו מזכירים אותם לשבח. Same thing then. There's something, though, that they did get rewarded for. The people said good things about them. שלא יצא אישה משל אחת מהם מבוסמת מעולם. The women never wore perfume in their family because they didn't want people to say, below od, right? And we'll see in a minute, they didn't want people to say they took it from the Pitum Aktoret, from the Ktoret. Below od elak shaya chabehem nosei isha. This is a great one. When someone would get married to a woman, mimakom acher, from some other family, haya posekim al manat shelo titpasem. It was part of the agreement of marriage was, listen, you have to know that if you're marrying me, you won't ever be able to wear perfume. Okay, so they came to it knowing, if they didn't want that, well, then they'd say, okay, sorry, but we're not getting married. So the people wouldn't say, not that they were even using it, but they were using, and this is, maybe I should explain this better with the lechem hapanim. The people wouldn't say they were using the secret how to make Torah that they learned from what they do in the temple for their own perfume. And here they actually quote the verse. Well, the story with Beit Avtinas continues. So Rabbi Yossi says, we're going to see one story with a tinok and a young child, and another with a zaken, an elderly person. So first he's in Yerushalayim with this tinok. He says, oh, what's your family name? Amarli mimishpacha ploni, which is Beit Avtinas. Amartilo, Beni, and as Ploni is just so-and-so, but what it means is he was from the Beit Avtinas family. Amartilo. So I said to him, Beni, avotecha, lefi shenitkavnu lirabot. Now we're in, by the way, the time after the destruction of the temples. He says to the father, your fathers, lefi shenitkavnu lirabot kvodanu, lema'et kvod shamayim. What was their goal? They wanted to make their own family a well-respected family. And they didn't do kvod shamayim. If they really had God's will in mind and to respect God, they would have told other people the secret. They obviously were just looking for their own sake. And therefore, lefichach, kvodan, look what happened now. Kvodan nitma'et, there's no longer a temple. They have no respect anymore. They're nobodies because who needs Torah anymore? Ukvod shamayim nitrabeh, but what happened? The glory of God was increased because even without a temple, people are respecting God still. Amar Rabbi Akiva. Okay, so that's one story. Now we have another story. Sachli Shimon ben Logan, melakei ta'iti asavim. Ani v'tinok echad mishel Beit Avtinas. Right, I and another one from Beit Avtinas. Remember the famous story of Rabbi Akiva with the fox? Fox comes out from the remains of the temple and he's laughing while everyone's crying, right? And it's this thing about I'm laughing because I see the future. So this is a similar story, although it's not Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is telling the story. He's not the one who's laughing and crying, but we're going to see the same laughing and crying here. So he says, Shimon ben Loga told me the story. I was with another, also a child. We were in the fields gathering grass. All of a sudden I see him crying and laughing. I said, why'd you cry? I was sad because of the respect that my family had that they no longer have. Why'd you laugh? I know in the future there'll be glory for them. The temple will be rebuilt and they'll be able to make the Torah again. What made you all of a sudden think about this, right? We all have all sorts of things that jar our memory. He says, I saw that plant called the Ma'aleh Hashan. Nimiti lo b'ni here'euli. I said, oh, show it to me. I want to see it, right? It's this big kept secret. Amar lo Rebbe Masoret biyadai me'avotai shelo laharoto l'briyah. I'm sorry, but I have them as tradition. I can't show anybody. So even after the destruction, they kept this a big secret. Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Yuri. Another story. Pagabi zaken echad mishal Beit Avtinas. I was with a zaken, an elderly from Beit Avtinas. Umigilat samanim biyado. He had a list of all, like how did the recipe for the Pitum Aktoret. Amar li Rebbe l'shaval. Now here the zaken. This story is very different than all the others. The elderly comes up to him and he says, the elderly person, he says, Rebbe l'shavar hayu Beit Abba tznu'im. They were very discreet in the past, my family. They would only pass down this recipe one to the other. Because my father's family is no longer, you could say with the faith, or they're not right. They're no longer such good people anymore. And they're not, therefore I don't trust them anymore. This is a very important story. We'll talk about it in a minute. I'm giving you this Megillah and I want you to watch over it. And when I told this to Rabbi Akiva, he says, we no longer have to say bad things about this family. We can now respect them, okay, because they've now given over the secret. This is a very interesting story, and it's very possible that as part of this genre of stories, which is trying to show that after the destruction, right, where there's always this, even in the time of the temple, there was this thing between the Kohanim and the rabbis. And if you even saw the other day, they talked about how the rabbis got paid to teach the Kohanim, and as if like the Kohanim are getting their right from us, even though we saw other cases where the people who were Chachamim didn't understand what goes on in the temple, right? But there it was trying to stress it's the rabbis who were teaching the Kohanim how to do what they do. And this is the power struggle between the Kohanim and the rabbis. And after the temple, the rabbis were trying to say, we're the address now, right? We're the center. And this story is exactly telling that, right? The passing over of the tradition from the people who worked in the temple to the rabbis. It's a very big, historical statement, and I would say even political, right? It's trying to say we're now the true leaders. And that's why they didn't like that people were keeping secrets, because the rabbis wanted to have the control and the knowledge, and, in a good way and in a bit of a power political way, right? It's both. It's very, very interesting here. Okay, last two people. Elazar la parochet. What was his job? He was in charge of all the weavers in the temple who were weaving the parochet. They'd have to replace the parochet. I think we said once a year or twice a year they would have to replace it. So he was in charge of all the people, the weavers. Pinchas HaMalbish. Now, the dresser. What was the dresser's job? He was in charge of dressing the Kohen Gadol. Now you think, okay, what does it take to dress the Kohen Gadol? So there's a debate exactly what he did. Was he like a tailor and he would fix it to be the right height and the right length and all that? Or was his job to actually, like a king has someone who dresses the king? You could wear the same dress as someone else, but if you put it on, right, you could wear a dress properly, you could wear it not properly, right? So there's an idea about how you dress, and that someone was there to make sure the Kohen Gadol, and this we talk about a lot, and we'll get to it in Yom also, the importance of the Kohen Gadol looking respectful. And therefore, he was in charge of making sure that the Kohen Gadol had that look so that people would be in awe of him. There was a story about a Kohen, maybe he was from the family of Pinchas, who knew how to dress people. He was in charge of dressing some Roman officer, and he got a lot of money for this, either 8 gold coins or 12 gold coins. Maybe this is here in case you would say this is not really a very serious job. Here you can see that also the Romans treated this job as a very serious job, and also by us, we had it as a serious job. Okay, moving on. Halacha bet. Ein pochatin mishiva amarkalin ushlosha gizbarim. Okay, we had this no less than 7, no more than 3, remember, by Havdalah. So here we also have no less than 7 Amar Kalim. There's a whole debate about what is it Amar Kol, he says and everybody listens, like he says everything and he's in charge. Does it mean he's an emir, like an emirates, an emir, which is a leader? Is it another? It could be without the letter Aleph. If you drop it, you get Mar Kol, like the Mar is Adon, the head of everyone. So whatever it means, he's in charge of other people. And he's in charge of the 3 Gizbarim. Okay, so you need at least 7 Amar Kalin who are in charge of 3 Gizbarim. It's a little bit weird. Usually people in charge are in charge of more people. This is a little bit weird. It's the opposite. Some people have the nusach, which we're going to see later in the Gemara, Srara al Mamon Hatzibor. You can't be in charge of money, communal money, unless it's 2 people. We all know this, because if you have 2 people, it's like in Amutah in Israel, and NGO needs 2 people to sign for things, because you always have to make sure no one's trying to funnel money out for their own sake. And therefore, obviously, people do it somehow anyway. But the idea is that this is a protection. So that if you have 2 people, one's doing a check on the other. Chutz mi. Now, if you say it's mamon, these exceptions are a little troublesome because they're not money. Other than ben achiyash al cholei me'ayim, velazar sh'ala parochet, these 2 people, shotan kiblu rov hatzibor alehem. They were accepted. People had 100% trust in them and therefore allowed them to be the only ones in charge. But normally they had 2 people in charge of everything. So the Gemara starts off and brings a braita. Tane Mishneh katlikim. By the way, all these words, gizbal, amarkal, talikim, these are all from the Romans. Okay, they're words borrowed from the Romans. Talikin are people in charge of the amarkalim. Okay, these are the hierarchies. Hadu dechtiv, and we're going to quote a verse from Divrei Hayamim, which actually was in the time of Chizkiyahu, and he had people, they did a big reform in the temple, and these are the people that collected the trumot that they brought. And it just gives a list, okay? They're going to cut the pasuk. It gives a list of 10 people, and it says, oh, the first 3 must be the Gizbalim, and the next 7 are the Amarkalim, even though it doesn't say that in the pasuk. I want to make that clear. So Yechiel, Uziel, V'Nachat, those are the first 3 mentioned. They're the Gizbalim. The next 7 mentioned, Asael, Yerivot, Yozavad, Eliel, Yismachiyahu, Umachat, Ubenayahu, they're Amarkalim. Then it says, Pkidim miyad kavanayu v'shimi achiv. Then there were another 2 people in charge of them. That must be the katzilikin, those 2 in charge. B'mifked Yechizkiyahu HaMelech v'Azaryahu nigi beit Elokim. Now we get to the hierarchy. That's HaMelech and the Kohen Gadol. Okay, so then you have the 2 above them, which is the king and the high priest. Now, how did it work? If you wanted to put away money to save in the temple, what would you do? You would have to seal it. So how would it work? Kishu chotem, if you wanted to seal away money, Hagizbar chotem v'nono lamarkal. Amarkal chotem v'nono lekatlikon. Okay, the Gizbar, we get it, the treasurer, he would pass it on to the Amarkal, to the, I'm trying to think of the word they use in English for it, but to the trustee. The trustee would pass it to the katlikin. Katlikon chotem v'nono lekohen gadol. He would pass it on to the kohen gadol. Kohen gadol chotem v'nono lemelech. So, and basically they would seal it a number of times, each one with their own signature on it. Ukishu matil hamelech, when you want to take out the money, hamelech ro'ech chotamo umatir, he would see his signature and he would undo it. Then kohen gadol ro'ech chotamo matir, katilikin ro'ech chotamo matir, markal ro'ech chotamo matir, gizbar ro'ech chotamo matir. So basically everyone goes down the line and undoes their seal. Ein osim schara latzibor b'mamon pachot mishnayim. Rav Nachman b'shem Rabbi Mana says al shem. He's going to learn it from a pasuk in the Torah. He says, "V'hem yikhu et hazahav et tatcheda et argamam." When they collected the items for the clothing of the Kohen Gadol, it says, and they took the zahav, the tcheda, the argaman. They is plural. That means 2. Amar Rabbi Chama be Rabbi Chanina. Now we're going to talk about that Moshe was wealthy. Now this is similar. The Kohen Gadol was also had to be wealthy. He had to every day bring a mincha offering of his own money. And we talk a lot, we're going to see this in Yoma, about the glory in the temple and how just like he needed to be dressed properly, he also was a wealthy person. Wealthy people always are more respected, unfortunately, right? Shouldn't necessarily be that way. It happens to be people often respect wealthy people. Again, not always, there's wealthy people don't respect, but wealth does bring respect. We saw from the famous story of Rabbi Yeshua and Rabban Gamliel. Kicked out Rabban Gamliel from the Nisiut, and then they wanted to bring Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah. They said he's a good person because he's also wealthy. It was one of the things that he had that was he was mentioned in a good way about. So now Moshe apparently was rich also. Now he couldn't have been rich from Egypt when they all took the money from the Mitzrayim because he was busy then. He didn't take the money. He didn't take all their jewels like everyone else did. So where did he get his money from? And right, it's a little bit suspicious. He was the one who was involved in collecting the money. So now they're going to say, where did he get his money from? Mipsolet shaluchot Shiur Moshe. The luchot were made of stone, and when they hewed the stone, right, you get some of the parts that weren't used. He took from there. How do we know this? Because it says psol lecha shnei luchot avanim. This is a series of drashot that when they say lecha, like shlach lecha, send for you. You want miraglim. I don't want spies. You want spies. Send for yourself. Psol lecha is take for yourself. Okay. That the remainders, whatever's left that wasn't part of the luchot, should be yours. Some people say this disagrees. Some people say this just explains where he got the stone from, that God showed him like a quarry of stones that was from his tent or near his tent. And that's where he got wealthy. K'tiv. Now, there's this line after in Shemot chapter 33, after the sin of the golden calf. And then it says, and Moshe went to he pitched Ohel Moed outside the camp, and he would go there. And it says, when he would go there, everyone would watch him. Now, watch him in what kind of way? So we're going to have a debate. Train Amorim, 2 different Amorim. Chadamar l'Genai, Chadamar l'Shevach. Very connected to what we were just talking about, people who were, some people respected, some people didn't respect, or some people said this was negative. Some people said it was positive. What way? The one Manda Amar Lignai, the one who said people were looking at him in a very negative way, they would look at him and say, Chamon Shakin, Chamon Krain, Chamon Kupad. Look how fat his legs are. Look how fat his calves are. Look how fat his legs are. Look how fat his body is. Where did he get fat from? Where does he have all this fat? Right, even though there was obviously no food in the desert, only man, but somehow, right? This is obviously was going on in their time and putting it on Moshe, because obviously he didn't have lavish food feasts in the desert. But they said he took this all from the Jews, right? He used public funds for his own, right? This is just classic of what people say about people in their own generation. Umandamar the Shevach, those who say no, they were looking at him in awe, say, so it's best if you look after tzaddikim, you'll be like tzaddikim. And that's an amazing thing to look at a tzaddik, and you will learn from them. So two different approaches to this, which again is just a way of talking about their own leaders in their time and how some people respected people and some people didn't, or maybe there were ones worthy of respect and ones that weren't. Okay, halacha gimel, let's move on. We'll read the Mishnah and then we'll leave the Gemara for tomorrow. Arba'a chotamot hayu b'mikdash. Okay, now we're going to learn about these tokens kind of things. Okay, there were tokens you would go and you would buy. Now, this is all about the nisachim. There were libations, as I said, that went along with it. We say this in our prayer. Shlosha esronim lapar ushne esronim la'ayel isaron echad. What is it? La'ayel lakeves. I forget, but isaron echad. So what does it mean? It means depending on what animal you brought, there was a certain amount of libations that you brought. And so I said, you brought a meal offering. So isaron is the amount of flour that you would use. So if it was the cattle, it would be 3 esronim of solet. Okay, that's the most. The next down is the isaron lakeves. Thank you. It eluded me while I was saying it. Isaron lakeves. So 1 isaron for a keves for the lambs and the sheep. And the middle is the ram, which is a sheep that's that's in its second year, 2-year-old sheep would be 2. So there's 3, 2, 1. And then when it comes to there's half a hin of wine and oil for the big animal, a third of a hin, which half a hin is 6 log, a third of a hin for the next level down, the ayil, and a quarter of a hin, which would be 3 log for the sheep and the lambs. So now they would have these 4 chotamot. Now you would think 3, because we just gave 3 examples. We'll have to see what the 4th is. Egel, zachar, gdi, v'chote. Chote is for the mitzorah. The mitzorah had to bring 3 animals, 2 kvasim, 1 for chatat, one for olah, 1 for asham, and a kivsa, a female lamb, for a chatat. Okay, that's what the mitzorah would bring. We're going to see later that the poor mitzorah only brought 1 animal, and the other 2, the olah and the chatat, were brought with birds, and he would just bring a keves la'olah. So right now we're going to say there was egel, zachar. Zachar is an ayil because it's the male sheep. That's 2 years old, a gdi and a chote, right? Gdi is anyone in the sheep family, and the chote is for the mitzorah who has to bring these 3. We'll see later why he's separate. Ben Azai Omer Chamisha Hayu, there were 5, not 4. The Aramith Katuv Alehin, 2 things he disagrees about. They were written in Aramaic so that people would understand, because people spoke Aramaic then. Egel Dechar Gdi Chote Dal V'Chote Ashir, that's what would be written. Dechar is Zachar in, right? It's the ayil in Aramaic. Egel Meshameshim Niskei Bakar Gdolim Uktanim Zchalim Nekebot. Egel was any cattle, large, small, male, female. Gdi Meshameshim Nichsei Atzon Gdolim Uktanim Zchalim Nekebot. Chutz Mishel Elim, that was the only exception that didn't fall into the tzon. It was all the sheep and lambs except for the ayil. Ayil Meshameshim Niskei Elim Bilvad, that was used only for when you needed an ayil. And Chotem Meshameshim Niskei Shalosh Behemot Shel Mitzorah, the 3 animals of the Mitzorah. Now, how would it work? Mishum Vakesh Nisachim, Holech Etzel Yochanan, Shu Memuneh al Chotamot. You would go to Yochanan, who's in charge of the Chotamot. V'noten lo ma'ot, he paid the money. U'mekabel mimenu chotam, you get a chotam. Balo etzel achiyah. Then you would take your token. You go to achiyah. Shu memuneh al nisachim, v'noten lo chotam, u'mekabel mimenu nisachim. Then you would take your token, right? It's like you go pay for a falafel, right? You pay at the desk, and then you go take your receipt and you give it to the guy who's making it. La'erev ba'in ze etzel zeh. At night they would go Achia and Yochanan, and they would count up. Achia motzi et chotamot and mekabel kinegdam ma'od. He was the supplier of all the stuff, so he would get his money from Yochanan. He would say, "I got 10 tokens. Give me 10 worth of money, right? Depending on what token and how much he spent." Im pachatu. What if he didn't have enough money to pay Achia for what Achia had tokens? So pachatu lo v'yishalem Yochanan mi beito. He was in charge. He would have to pay out of pocket. V'im hotiru lehekdesh. If he had extra money and Achia had less tokens, then the extra money would go to the hekdesh, sheyad hekdesh al Yonah would go to the kuppah of the temple. Misha abar chotamo, what if I lost my chotemet? And then I couldn't, right? I bought one and then I lost it. So what would happen? They wait till nighttime. And if they saw that there was extra money and not a token, they realize I lost my token and they give me. So if they found extra money, they would give me the stuff. If they didn't find the extra money, they'd assume I was lying. Here you get into all people lying. We'll get into this more tomorrow. Last line for today. They write the name of the day because people might find a token that I had lost on the street, right? In the temple, let's say, and they might remember, this is like done in the Harabayit, so it was a big space. Could have lost it. Someone could pick it up and find it and try to get the libations out of it. So therefore, they wrote the name of the day, and we'll see tomorrow that they wrote even more than just the name of the day, so that if they assume if it was Monday, and today's Monday, if someone brings the thing on Monday, well, I'm looking for my missing one, they'll realize that he stole it. Okay, but if it's Tuesday, when I've already stopped looking, then maybe he'll be able to take it, and that would be a problem. And Yochanan would have to pay out of pocket. So they put the name of the day on it. And we'll see later that they put even more than that to make sure that people didn't steal. Again, we get into all the interpersonal and things about people trying to steal and all that. Again, there was a lot today. It's a long daf. Anyway, we'll pick up where tomorrow. Have a Shabbat Tov, everyone.